How's it, young Stashes? My name is Dr. CyberLink. This is Stashy, and this week we're gonna do things a little differently. I know in the past been doing all these videos with animations. It's better that we just do it one-on-one, you and me, in the virtual classroom, and we just do these topics together. So without further ado, this week's topic, we're going to be doing the French Revolution. Now this is quite fitting because the French Revolution plays off in Paris, France. And this year, where is the Olympics? In Paris, France. We've got all these athletes running around, controversial ceremonies. Is it the Last Supper? Is it not the Last Supper? We don't know. But 250 years ago, if you want to talk about controversy, there's no revolution which better encapsulates revolution than the French Revolution. I mean, this was the goat of revolutions, which is quite weird, I know. But this is where key concepts such as fraternity, equality, and liberty came to the fore. So, in the next couple of episodes, we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. And when you do look at the Olympics, think about the places where they have these various events. For example, the Place de la Concorde, which is where they have all the skating events and the BMX trials. Well, that is where King Louis and Marie Antoinette and other leading figures were killed by a guillotine. So as I said earlier, my name is Dr. CyberLink. This is Stashy. You're watching the Historian Stash. Please hit a like, share and subscribe if you like this content on the channel. We are small, but we are growing steadily and we'd love your support. So on that note, let's gooi. Now before we get into the French Revolution, I think it's important that we place the revolution in context to what was happening elsewhere in the West. Okay, so the French Revolution had general causes common to all the revolutions of the West at the end of the 18th century. And then there were particular causes that explain why it was by far the most violent and the most universally significant of these revolutions. Because it was pretty hardcore. It got really violent, and there were all these conditions that led up to the revolution being so violent. So what we try and do is explore why did it get to that point, and what were the conditions that led to it being so violent. So firstly, if we look at the general causes of societal norms that were present at the time of the French Revolution in the 18th century, it would be social structures of the West, namely the feudal system. Okay, now what is the feudal system? We covered this in a couple of episodes, going the whole hierarchy of the king being the top dog, then you had the nobility, the clergy, and then right at the bottom you had the poor oaks called the peasants. Okay, now there was also a group of oaks that between the nobility and the peasants, they were prosperous landowners, and these oaks were called bourgeois or bourgeoisie. Alright, they were professionals, they were manufacturers, merchants, and they aspired to political power. Now they wanted an improved standard of living, they wanted education, and they wanted to get rid of feudalism as it stood at that time. So they could acquire the full rights of landowners and to be free to increase their holdings. A second cause was the standard of living and population boom at the time in Europe. So from about 1730 you had higher standards of living which had reduced the mortality rate among adults. This, together with other factors, had led to an increase in the population of Europe which was unprecedented for several centuries. Now the third cause was economic crisis. Okay, there was a larger population which created a greater demand for food and consumer goods. As you saw with the expansion and conquest episodes that we did earlier, there were new gold mines being dug up in Brazil and the rest of South America. And the discovery of gold there led to an increase in the prices of normal consumer goods in Europe. So from about 1770, the economic crises increased, and this provoked alarm and even revolt. Now the fourth cause can be attributed to the philosophies of the Enlightenment era, or era. The arguments for social reform began to be advanced. You had thinkers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu who challenged the status quo. They advocated for liberty and fraternity and equality, those three things that I mentioned earlier. And in the minds of many intellectuals at the time, revolution seemed necessary to apply their ideas. So it became that revolution was the only thing where they could actually apply what these thinkers were saying. That if we wanted freedom, if we wanted equality, we needed to go revolt. So this got to a point where revolution seemed to be the only option. The Enlightenment was spread among the educated classes by the many societies of thought that were founded at the time, such as Masonic lodges. So the Freemasons, they were in charge of spreading all these ideas of enlightenment. And then you also had agricultural societies and reading rooms. So your normal little reading group in the library, they were spreading revolutionary ideas that could and would eventually lead to revolution. Now, importantly, it's uncertain whether revolution would have come without the added presence of a political crisis. During virtually the entire 18th century, Europe was plagued by war. These wars cost money, so the monarchs of Europe sought to raise money by taxing the nobles and clergy. Now, these nobles and clergy had until then been exempt from paying taxes, so they didn't pay taxes at all until this point when wars were costing these kingdoms and these states dearly. And nothing hurts a nobleman more than when his pockets become empty. So the monarchs now had a problem. They had to justify this new kind of taxation of trying to tell the nobles, listen, I want your money. So they themselves promoted the arguments of the Enlightenment thinkers by adopting the role of enlightened despots. Okay, so these guys who are checking from above, they saying to the nobles, hey, check your privilege, my bro. Which is kind of warped, I would say. Now, this inevitably provoked all sorts of reaction throughout Europe among the nobles and the elite aristocratic classes. Even in North America, where they had their newly formed colonies, there was backlash, and this backlash caused the American Revolution. So if you ever watched Mel Gibson in The Patriot, that's that war, even though highly inaccurate. Now, the American Revolution began with the refusal of these aristocratic classes to pay a tax imposed by the King of Great Britain. European monarchs tried to stop this reaction of the aristocracy, so in a subtle power play, both rulers and the privileged classes sought allies among the non-privileged bourgeois and the peasants. Yeah, so what they're doing is they're trying to play each other off, using the bourgeois and the peasants as useful idiots, as Lenin would say, trying to get them on their side. But this would backfire in France. So now let's look at France. Now, if we look at France in the late 18th century, it was ruled by an oak called King Louis XVI, and he was the monarch from what was called the Ancient Regime, okay, or Ancien Regime, or whatever they call it in France. This era was marked by a rigid social hierarchy and absolute monarchical power. What this meant was that the king had absolute power. He made the laws. He said who died, who lived. He was ordained by God to basically look over everyone, and it was almost seen as if he was the conduit between the people and God to decide what was to happen with the country, which is a lot of responsibility, but also a heck load of power given to one person. So at the time, French society was divided into 3 estates. The first estate comprised the clergy or the church, and then the second estate comprised of the nobility, and then the third estate represented the common people, which included peasants, urban workers, and the flourishing bourgeoisie. Oui. By the 1780s, France was in financial turmoil, burdened by debt from costly wars and extravagant royal spending. The tax system was grossly unfair, and the third estate shouldered most of that financial burden. So these poor oaks, the bourgeois, the peasants, they had to pay it all. All the debt that King Louis and his boys and girls were spending on lavish parties and all sorts of things. Hunts. The French loved royal hunts. All of that went a long way in really messing up the bourgeois and the peasants and saying, but why do we have to pay for all of this lavishness? Which is quite a fair point.
There is a story that goes that after being told that the starving peasant subjects had no bread, Marie Antoinette, wife of King Louis XVI, responded infamously, "Let them eat cake." Because cake is more expensive than bread. The anecdote has been cited as an example of the Queen's obliviousness to the conditions and daily lives of ordinary people. However, it's highly probable that she never even said these words. Instead, folklore scholars have found similar tales in other parts of the world, although the details differ from one version to another. For example, there is a tale from 16th century Germany about a noblewoman who wonders why the hungry poor don't simply eat krosem or a sweet bread. The first person to put the specific phrase into print may have been the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In Book 6 of Rousseau's Confessions, written in about 1767, he relates a version of the story, attributing the quote to a great princess. Although Marie Antoinette was a princess at the time, she was still a child in 1767, so it is unlikely that she was the princess Rousseau was referring to. Since Rousseau's writings inspired the French revolutionaries, it has sometimes been thought that they picked up on this quote, falsely credited it to Marie Antoinette, and spread it as propaganda, as a way to rouse opposition against the monarchy. However, contemporary researchers are skeptical of such claims, having found no evidence of the quote being used as propaganda. In fact, the earliest known source connecting the quote with the Queen was published more than 50 years after the French Revolution.
So at that time, the man seen as being responsible for all of France's economic woes was a dude called Jacques Necker. Okay, I hope I'm saying it right, although, it's the French. Now, a decade earlier, Necker had financed the participation of French troops in, ironically enough, the American War of Independence. This and other lavish expenditures had caused a mass accumulation of debt. So by 1788, France stood on the verge of bankruptcy. So these guys were like VBS, but on a much grander scale. Now, poor King Louis had to bring economic reform to France, and part of these reforms was to consult the Estates General in order to handle France's economic status. The Estates General was a parliament that was composed of representatives of all 3 estates. Okay, so up until this point, the Estates General, those guys had not convened for more than 175 years. So on the 5th of May 1789, the Estates General convened at the Palace of Versailles, which was the king's official residence. In this meeting, the Third Estate pushed for voting rights. The First and Second Estates refused to grant them these rights. So angered by this, the Third Estate broke away and later formed the National Assembly. So when the National Assembly was established by the breakaway of the bourgeois Third Estate, that was the spark that ignited the French Revolution. So the members of the National Assembly, they tried to get support from sympathetic nobles and clergymen. On the 20th of June, these members were locked out of a meeting of the Estates General at Versailles. So instead of convening in the palace, they chose to meet in a nearby tennis court. Here they swore to remain until a constitution is established. So this oath, this swearing, a lot of swearing, not cussing, but swear, I swear that we will get this done. That swearing, that oath that was taken would be called the tennis court oath, because they went to a tennis court. So quite original. Now, quite interestingly, Necker, of all people, was a strong advocate for the merging of all three of their states. This was the guy that got France into economic woes, but now he wanted to get the Third Estate out and say, yeah guys, you guys have got equal rights. Which I guess, maybe he was pressured, or maybe it was a sense of redemption on his part. Either way, that was his call. So he proposed a program of constitutional and social reforms, but this was vetoed by the other two estates. These first two estates fiercely opposed Necker, and so he was eventually dismissed on the 11th of July 1789 because of his apparent sympathies towards the National Assembly. Necker's dismissal led to mass riots in Paris, and this ultimately culminated in the storming of the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille is quite hectic in French history. They sing about it, they chant about it. It's quite intense. Now, what is the storming of the Bastille, and what was the Bastille? Now, the Bastille is a prison in Paris, and it held high-ranking state prisoners, and as such it was seen as a symbol of state oppression by the masses. It was guarded by 18 cannons, 12 artillery pieces, 32 grenadiers and 82 veteran soldiers. So it was quite heavily guarded. But unfortunately, that prison was actually scheduled to be destroyed because the government wanted to move the prisoners out. They thought that having a castle as a prison was so last year, so they wanted to get that out, and instead they want to move it to an open area. So the Bastille was actually seen as defunct. These poor guys that were left behind, they were guarding an empty shell, except for a few prisoners that still remained behind. I think there were 7 prisoners that remained behind there. So on the 14th of July 1789, there were rumors that went around that the king's troops were marching through Paris to end all the riots that were taking place. In response to this rumor, an estimated 600 to 1,000 people assembled with weapons that had been seized from the military hospital at the Hotel des Invalides. The crowd then gathered in front of the Bastille to collect military equipment. After unsuccessful talks on the part of Bernard René de Launay, I hope I'm saying that right too, who was the governor of the Bastille, the attacking mob forced their way into the undefended outer courtyard. Once there, they gained momentum and then they stormed the prison itself. Now, during the fighting, 98 attackers and only 1 defender were killed. After the fight, the mob seized control of the Bastille and they dragged Delaunay through the streets of Paris, and they eventually stabbed him to death. Oof, rough deal. Along the way, they also found another dude who was a high-ranking official, and his name was Jacques de Fezelt, and they assassinated him as well. And they took both of these guys, cut their heads off after death, and then put them on pikes and ran across Paris with their heads on top of these pikes. On top of that, there were 3 veteran soldiers who were defending the Bastille, and they were also executed by the mob after they had surrendered. So it was really brutal. Now, following the fall of the Bastille, word spread quickly about it, and this prompted further uprisings across the whole of France, not just Paris. The event supposedly symbolized the overthrowing of royal tyranny. The storming of the Bastille forced King Louis XVI to accept the National Assembly. The National Assembly moved swiftly to implement reforms. Feudal privileges were abolished, church lands were nationalized, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was introduced, laying down the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So all these good things were happening, but the bad things that were leading to these good things being done were quite bad and horrific. But with all these things established, like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the revolution was still far from over. War with Austria and Prussia, internal conflicts, and the rise of radical groups like the Jacobins pushed the revolution into a more tumultuous and bloody phase. And this phase we'll deal with next time. Until that time, I'm Dr. Bastille. This is Stashy. Thanks for watching. Please hit that like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends about it. And please, let's help grow this channel together. Until next time, stay Stashy.